Good evening. I want to welcome everybody here to NYU's Program on Corporate Compliance and Enforcement's panel, Wading into the Gray, Compliance and Enforcement Lessons When Good People Make Bad Decisions. I'm Serena Vash. I'm the Executive Director of the Program on Corporate Compliance here at NYU School of Law. And I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists to you. They are listed in our program, so if you want to get a little bit of a better understanding of exactly who they are, go ahead and read that. But I'll give a quick introduction of them. I will go in this order. We have Supervisory Special Agent William McMurray. Agent McMurray has been a special agent with the FBI for 20 years and has spent a good deal of his career investigating international organized crime. Agent McMurray was selected in July 2015 as the supervisor of a newly formed international corruption squad in the New York Field Division. Next to Special Agent McMurray is Rashmi Aaron. Ms. Aaron is a motivational speaker. She is a graduate and a Kent Scholar from Columbia Law School and began practicing law at a nationally recognized firm and later became an attorney for the Miami-Dade County. She eventually opened up her own legal practice. Next to Rashmi is Richard Bystrong. He's the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery LLC, a former FCPA violator and FBI cooperator. He is now an anti-bribery consultant. And finally, Walt Palvo, who is the founder and president of Prisonology, who is a consulting expert and testifies for lawyers and defendants on the post-conviction process of the federal judicial system. So today's program brings to you a number of individuals who were, through the course of their business practices, convicted of federal crimes. And Agent McMurray and myself, I'm a former federal prosecutor. Before we start talking about wading into the gray, how these issues can arise in business, I'd like you all to think about two things. I'd like you to keep two thoughts in your mind. First, every person is the hero or the protagonist of his or her own story. I'm not the first to say that. It was first said in 1812, every traveler is necessarily the hero of his own story, especially if he travels alone. And again in 1920, during a criminal investigation, when the investigator says, whatever we may say, whatever we may think, we think, down at the bottom is the fundamental craving that each man must in some way satisfy, the craving to be the hero of his own story. The second point I'd like you to keep in mind, and it is from our CLE packet, Behavioral Legal Ethics from Jennifer Robinolt and Jean Sterlite, where they are quoted as saying, some have suggested that lawyers behave badly because they are inherently bad, or unintelligent, because they are susceptible to undue pressure from their clients, because they are underregulated, or even because they are overregulated. However, psychological research suggests a more complex story, that those who commit ethical infractions are not necessarily bad apples, but are human beings. Many ethical lapses result from a combination of situational pressures and all too human modes of thinking. So as we begin today, and we look at the process of how did corporate misconduct occur, how did something go wrong, let's keep in mind that we all see ourselves as good, as ethical, and as well-intentioned, that we are all human. I'd like to begin by asking Walt Palvo to talk a little bit about his educational background and then talk about the circumstances that led to his federal conviction.
Sure. Thank you for allowing me to be here. My name is Walt Palvo. I have an engineering degree, an undergraduate degree in industrial engineering, and an MBA with concentration in finance. I went to work at MCI Telecommunications a number of years ago, and I worked in their resale division, companies that bought long distance from MCI and then resold it under their own brand name. Some of these companies, like WorldCom was a customer of ours. Enron got involved in some long distance. Adelphia, Global Crossing. I know it sounds like a police lineup now, but if you go back in time, these were some of the great growing companies at the time. And I was in charge of collections and billing. managing about $1 billion a month in revenue. And during this time, we also brought on new resellers of telecommunications that were in less than savory businesses: pornography, gambling, and fortune-telling. Not the sorts of businesses you want to be associated with when your motto at your company is friends and family, right? But we would sell to other small companies who got involved in those businesses, and as you can imagine, they weren't the best of business people, and proceeded to run up large debts with our company. And when I tried to collect it, I found addresses that didn't exist, customers that didn't exist, and repayments that just weren't going to happen. And rather than report those poor results, we decided, a group of us, to cook the books before it was known as cook the books, make the revenue look better, make the bad debt not look as bad. And during the process of doing that, I also figured out a way to divert money from some of these unsavory customers to offshore bank accounts. So it just kept getting worse. I was sentenced to 41 months in federal prison, and my crime took place a number of years ago. And still, there's probably not a day that goes by that I don't think about what I did and the repercussions. And when Serena asked me to be a part of something like this in this panel, I jumped at it. So that's my story.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Richard Bystrong, please. If you could talk to us a little bit about your education, professional background, and the conduct that led you to your federal criminal conviction.
Well, Serena, and thank you again for the invitation to be a part of tonight's event. So my journey started at the University of Virginia. I was a foreign policy student at the Woodrow Wilson School of Government. So foreign policy was my first passion, and I received my master's degree there. I was headed into their PhD program, but I decided to follow a different track and entered, for me, it was then the fourth generation in a family business, manufacturing what we call bulletproof vests. That was a business started by my great-grandfather in 1888. And fast forwarding a little bit, my focus in that enterprise was U.S. law enforcement, U.S. military sales. Very high integrity, low risk marketplaces, very stable sales cycles. So our family business was so successful, we sold it in the mid-90s. And I ended up working for what was then a competitor. I did not want to be a former family member in this family business, which wasn't ours anymore. That felt a little awkward. So I ended up with a competitor, which was a successful, large, publicly traded company in the military and aerospace communities, manufacturing a very wide portfolio of products: armored systems, armored vehicles, riot control equipment, munitions, a lot of the product that Special Agent McMurray's team and he uses as well. 1997, I then am offered the opportunity to switch marketplaces and to become the VP of international sales of that enterprise. So for me, that's why I mentioned the foreign policy background. It was like a dream come true, because I could fuse that foreign policy experience with my commercial success in those U.S. marketplaces, and then sort of take that on the road overseas. So that started a decade of travel all over the world. On average, I was overseas 250 days a year, and the company had operations in the United Kingdom, so I lived there part-time. The FCPA is a law that covers public officials, right? And in the overseas military marketplaces, your communities, your customers are all public officials. You're not selling commercially. You're selling to the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Defense. And very early on in this 10 years, I am exposed to, for lack of a better word, corruption. Intermediaries, agents, or fixers, that's how I use to promote the company's products, not a direct sales force. And very early, they start sharing with me in very colorful words like, we're taking care of people, we're paying tolls to win, we're making people happy. Lots of interesting words to describe paying a bribe. The one I never heard in 15 years was bribe, okay? That started a trajectory for lack of a better word, a slippery slope to where 10 years later, in the wake of the United Nations Oil for Food investigation, through an intermediary that was being investigated on a food contract, had nothing to do with me or my former company, but the UN investigators find a defense contract that connects that intermediary with me. And I was also engaging in a corrupt conspiracy to bribe a UN official to win a defense contract. So the UN turns over their findings to my former employer, who then dismisses me in part of the result of that investigation. But the head UN investigator was also a former federal prosecutor out of the Connecticut district. He turns over his findings to Maine Justice. I become the target of a criminal investigation, and I come in and proffer and basically say, I'm guilty, and we talked about the opportunities to mitigate the consequences of that conduct. That's pretty much from the first proffer session, and that led to 5 years of cooperation with federal law enforcement, 3 years covert, 2 years as a cooperating witness, and I was also nearly double charged in the United Kingdom. So I was also an undercover cooperator for the City of London Police and helped the Crown Prosecution Service in some of their prosecutions. So that all ended in July 2012. My plea agreement is basically finished now. I fulfilled my obligations. I'm facing a 5-year sentence. The government, because of my cooperation, comes in with 0 time of home confinement in their 5K letter. And the judge, Richard Leon in Washington, D.C., says that's not how we promote criminal deterrence, by sending wrongdoers home. That's not the message we give here. And he sentenced me to 18 months. And I came home after 14 and a half months in December of 2013.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rashmi, will you tell us a little bit about your educational and work background and what led you to your federal criminal conviction?
My name is Rashmi Aaron, and thank you again, Serena, for inviting me and for having me here on this panel. So I graduated in '93 from UNC Chapel Hill. I went on to work on Wall Street at Morgan Stanley in investment banking, and then from there I went to Columbia Law School, and I graduated from Columbia, as Serena mentioned, a Kent Scholar and basically high honors in '98. And from that point on, I worked in various capacities, either for big national law firms, smaller litigation boutiques, and eventually I worked for the government in Miami, but on the civil side. I'm from Miami. And in 2004, I opened my own title company. And this was in the heyday of real estate, all over the country, but really in South Florida, it was booming. And I was a solo practitioner with 2 young children and pounding the pavement, trying to grow my business. And in 2007, I was given the opportunity to meet a real estate developer, which as a solo practitioner is a big deal. You have all the big firms that have the big developer clients, which has all sorts of financial stability and reputational marketing abilities that come along with it. So I jumped at the opportunity, and I met the developer. And when I first met this developer, he brought me on and wanted me to conduct specific types of real estate transactions for condominiums that he had both in Tampa and in Palm Beach. So it ended up being important ultimately in the case because it's 2 separate districts in Florida. It's the Middle District of Florida and the Southern District of Florida, in which I was doing closings. This developer was doing what's called buyer incentives, which essentially was incentivizing the buyer to buy his condo units in ways that were seen to be illegal. And I knew that the seller was eventually giving the buyer money outside of closing as an incentive to buy the units. And it was all documented in the form of a rental guarantee and various other creative ways. And what I did in that moment, really, as I've looked back, is I wanted to have this client. I really wanted the stature that came along with it, the reputation, the financial stability, the comfort, not to have to go out and rain make all the time. So I didn't ask the tough questions. I didn't ask my underwriter whether it was legal. I simply asked, can this type of transaction be approved? Will the lenders approve them? So fast forward, I ended up doing about 100 closings in Tampa and about 100 closings in Palm Beach during 2008 and 9, and then stopped working in the title business. I ended up joining my father, who's been practicing for 30 years, and joined his practice and was running his legal practice as a managing partner, more as operations and HR and business development. I had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as my clients. We were sort of in the default services industry at that time. And in 2011, the FBI knocked on my door, and even though I'm a lawyer and I should know this, I really didn't know that you don't have to talk to the FBI without an attorney or when they happen to come to your door. So I let them in my office. I spoke to them for 4.5 hours without an attorney and answered all sorts of questions. Really, I didn't know the answers of them. And at that point, I didn't know the reach of the government, of the FBI, and so I answered questions definitively that I really didn't know the answer to. Then nothing happened for 2 years, and in the summer of 2013, I received a grand jury subpoena through my attorney, and pretty soon after that, a couple months later, it was pretty clear that I was a target, and it felt like my whole life was falling apart. I had 2 little children, and I kept fighting it. I really still didn't believe I had done anything wrong. And in April 2014, and really my prosecutor was a special investigator out of HUD from DC, and the prosecutor really kept pushing to see if I would come in and make a deal and help and try to get the developer. And I was, on principle, I thought, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not going to go in, because I really didn't at that time think I'd done anything wrong. Eventually, after I got indicted and went through discovery, it was obviously really clear to me that I did do something wrong. And there was a lot of other things that this developer was doing that I actually did not know of, and I discovered through discovery and reviewing all the evidence. And I had to have that, looking that dragon in the eye, and I call it a coming to Jesus moment. I had to say, you know what, I did this, and I knew it was wrong. I wanted to believe it was okay, but I really knew it was wrong in my gut. The buyer's not supposed to get money. That's just a general principle. So eventually I pled guilty, and I cooperated as well with the government and testified against the developer. I was fortunate to have a lot of support from my community in Miami, and I credit that a lot to how I've survived this in a very positive way. And I approached it differently from the very beginning. I reached out to everybody in my life, meaning people from high school, elementary school, college, law school, and called them one by one, like 300 people, and told them what I did and asked for their help. And because of that, because of me owning it, I received a ton of support. So I had 200 letters to the judge in support of me, overflowing courtroom the day of my sentencing. Ultimately, I was sentenced to 1 year and 1 day in prison last year, June 16th of 2015. I had 60 days to surrender, and I was fortunate while I was in prison, I was asked to testify in another case in Tampa where I would have been indicted, but because I pled, we were able to work out a deal. And because of my further cooperation in Tampa, I received a Rule 35 by the prosecutor, so I actually was released after 5.5 months, so I was very fortunate. I've been home about 9 months, so I'm probably the freshest out of the 3 of us, and now I'm hoping to pay it forward and help people with my story.
Thank you very much. Special Agent McMurray, can you talk a little bit about what your position is right now with the FBI and the impetus for creating the FCPA squads?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. As Serena had said, I currently supervise a fairly new group here in the FBI here in New York, just down the street here in our main office, that focuses on international corruption. Specifically, the squad that I supervise, we investigate violations of the FCPA, kleptocracy, which is essentially money laundering cases that focus on foreign government officials that through various means illegally obtain money and then send it to the United States, invest it here in our banking systems or in real estate here in the United States. And then we also investigate international antitrust matters. As I said, it's a new squad. We've only been up and running for a bit over a year now, and what caused the creation of this squad is, as you can imagine, the FBI, we investigate, I forget how many violations we have now, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 250 different violations. And there's a constant struggle in FBI management to allocate resources towards specific threats. And obviously, since 9/11, the top threat that most of our resources have been allocated towards is terrorism. And a lot of the criminal violations that were historically sort of the cornerstone of what the FBI did were significantly less resourced. And when individual heads of our offices around the country, like as per here in New York, our assistant director in charge here in New York, they have to make a decision every year on how they're going to allocate the resources. And it's based primarily on what is the threat to New York City if you're the head of the FBI in New York. And it's hard to justify putting a lot of resources towards investigating crimes that occurred essentially on the other side of the world, or in South America, or where the easy to see threat to New York City in particular is not that easy to see. So these types of violations were continuously undermanned by federal law enforcement for a very long time. It created a lot of frustration at Maine Justice because Maine Justice has quite a large cadre of attorneys that are assigned to prosecute these types of cases, but they didn't have a large investigative body to take on the investigation. So they came up with a solution. It took a couple of years and a couple of sort of failures along the way to finally get to where we are now, where we have 3 separately funded squads around the United States, one in New York City, one in Washington, D.C., and one out in Los Angeles, where our funding stream comes from a separate funding stream than the rest of the office does, which allows us to investigate these crimes and not sort of get enveloped into the other violations that the office is tasked with investigating. So for the first time, we have a large cadre of agents in the FBI whose sole responsibility is to investigate international corruption. Along with the squads, we also have the funding where we have sent FBI agents out to. The numbers constantly change, but we're somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12 different countries now where we have FBI agents deployed in those countries and embedded, working side by side with our law enforcement counterparts in those countries that investigate public corruption in their country. So it's a huge game changer, really, for the way the FBI investigates these crimes. Just in the first year alone, the number of high-level investigations that have come to these squads it's really astounding, and it's actually more than we can take on just in this first year, because obviously corruption is endemic around the world, but it's a culture, it's a shift in culture within law enforcement where if you're a police officer in Moldova or in Brazil, your first thought when you're doing a public corruption case there wasn't necessarily, hey, there's U.S. companies here involved in paying bribes to our government officials that we're investigating. Let's pick up the telephone and call the FBI and get them involved in our case. That really wasn't the mindset, but it's quickly become the mindset in many places. And so our relationship that we have built in just a year's time is only going to grow more and more with countries all over the world that are investigating corruption.
Thank you. So there's a ton of research from sociologists, economists, psychologists, lawyers on why people commit corporate misconduct. They don't always agree. And so I'm just going to ask each one of you flat out in the vernacular, why did you commit the conduct that you committed, each of you? Why did you do it? And then we'll go into some of the research on these issues.
So as I've tried to go back and dissect this, and when you go through something like this, you have a lot of time to think. There's not just one answer. There's just so many pressures. For me personally, I believe that the pressures they stem from cultural pressures in my Indian culture. I come from a very prominent Indian family in Miami, very involved in our community, but also very hardworking. And so there's definitely this very high standard that gets set in my family, but across the community, in our Indian community, as well as abroad in India. And there was certainly a pressure to succeed, and along with that comes the desire to achieve that American dream. And that American dream, for most Indians, is defined as success, and that means making money and getting those big clients and achieving a higher level of reputation in the community. I'm the oldest of 3 daughters, and I also believe I felt pressure to succeed and prove that I was as good as a guy, as good as a boy, because again, there's a lot of pressure in our community. And then, there's the more human stuff, which is I'm a mother of 2 children, and at the time I was going through marital problems, and I had a lot of financial pressure to not only be a present mother, but also to succeed, and I was the major breadwinner in my family. And when I met this developer, I wanted it to be okay. I wanted this developer as a client because I thought it would lead to other developers as clients, which again meant more financial stability and the ability to do more things. And so I didn't ask the questions that I should have asked, and I knew in my gut it was wrong. So those were some of the reasons for me that I believe I allowed myself to go down this path without stopping it when I could have stopped it.
Okay. I think you're next, Walt.
You're going to pick on me. That's great. I'm with Rashmi. I don't think you can point to one specific thing, but I can tell you the most critical error that I made was what I call, isolated decision making. The inability to reach out to others and get some feedback as to what I was seeing around me. There was corruption around. I think each one of us could go through and see that we saw things that we didn't agree with, that influenced us in some way. But I think I internalized a lot of that, and most of the mistakes that I made as far as going across the line was because I made the decisions myself. I didn't bounce them off of anybody. I didn't speak back and say, hey, I see something wrong. I sort of took it internally and then, made my own, poor decisions. With that is coupled something I think is important for anybody that's in a corporation when you're looking at training your employees, is the value that someone puts on working at that company. There's probably nothing more important than the identity that you take on for working for an organization. MCI Telecommunications is one of the greatest companies I ever worked for. I loved the company. I loved what I did, and I respected, the people around me. And then when things weren't going well, I felt betrayed in many ways, and took it upon myself to make some really, really bad choices. But I will say that the identity that I had of working at a company and seeing things that were wrong and then not reacting to them the right way was pretty much a turning point for me.
Just before we get to Richard, you said you felt betrayed in many ways. Can you elaborate on why you felt betrayed?
So there was a lot of cheating that was going on. I mean, for lack of a better term, there was a lot of cutting corners, whether it was customers who were not paying their bills with MCI that I was supposed to collect, or with a company that was as a group was hiding this. And at first I felt like I was helping, and then after a while I realized I'm not helping, I'm cheating, and I'm no different than anybody else. And a lot of that I look at, and you can talk about rationalizing your behavior, but that's certainly a key. I mean, I looked at all that and say, geez, I'm no different than anybody else, and I'm knee deep in it, so why not go up to at least my waist? So I think that was the kind of the way that I sort of viewed it at the time. Not healthy.
So,
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you for the question, Serena. And before I took my first flight overseas in 1997, my company provided me with a copy of the FCPA, and they said, read it, and if you don't understand it, we'll get you resources to help you. Now, in 1997, that was a probably middle-of-the-road anti-bribery compliance program, and I didn't need any additional resources. I understood that bribing a public official to win or retain business was against the law. So I'm always sensitive to this question in the sense that, as I sort of pull the curtain back as to what I was thinking, it's not an exercise in ethical spinning, because at the end of the day, whatever I rationalized, there was only one person that was responsible for Richard Bistrong going to prison, and that's Richard Bistrong. So I'm happy to share those moments, but again, this isn't like a deflection at all. And I think, it starts for me with, the first time I was exposed to corruption was when an agent in Tierra del Fuego, which is the bottom tip of Argentina, is telling me that he's paying tolls to win tenders. And I certainly wasn't thinking, looking at the Antarctic tundra, so to speak, that I'm in the earshot of the FBI, right? So when my family and my defense lawyer said, "What were you thinking?" It was, I wasn't thinking I was going to get caught, okay? They call that optimism bias, I think, right? And, working and I didn't go to prison for just nodding my head when someone was telling me they were doing it. It certainly escalated from there, but with each experience and with each interaction with a corrupt, either foreign official or intermediary, again, living overseas, traveling in all parts of the world, not everyone embraces, ethical business the way we do. Not everyone shares our concerns. And working from remote offices, which is really whatever hotel room I was staying at that night, I start to think of corruption as the norm. This is how things get done. A social psychologist in Germany called it the cocoon of corruption. I trusted the people in that circle, the intermediaries, the agents, the foreign officials. We knew how it worked. Those support people back at the Home Office have no idea what it's like out here. So I just started to think of corruption as the norm. I was highly incentivized, sort of a eat what you kill pay plan, that my incentives were more than 50% of my total compensation. So some of these places, I thought, what does the company really want? That FCPA paperwork that I signed, or anti-bribery compliance? Because where I'm sitting right now, I can't deliver both. Now, that's a debate that regrettably I didn't share with my former employer or my family. I took compliance into my own hands, and the paycheck always won. And finally, and I just wrote about this on the FCPA blog, and there's some really wonderful research about this, Serena. I didn't think I was hurting anyone. So, I'm out in the field. Now let's look at this. I wasn't pulling layers out of a bulletproof vest to deliver a contract. So the company's product was never compromised. So I'm looking at it as the foreign agency gets a wonderful product. I make my bonus, my quota, and my forecast. The company, in some cases, might actually have to hire people or put on a second shift to manufacture the order. The intermediary moves on to the next deal. And in many of these countries, public officials are paid at what we might consider to be poverty wages. So that public official gets a little something to make ends meet. So, who's really getting hurt here? I mean, I wasn't spending my evenings on the Transparency International website thinking about how corruption robs and starves societies of governance and human rights and social development. I'm thinking this is a win-win. And, Francesca Gino, and I know some of the folks here are familiar with her work and her book Sidetracked, she actually says when your unethical conduct, you perceive it as benefiting others, you come to think of it as morally acceptable, and what she uses, the term, which I agree with, you think of it as altruistic. So those were a few of the clouds that I describe and how like my perfect storm of how I rationalized overseas corruption.
Thank you so much. So some of the researchers have said things such as, I mentioned earlier, many ethical lapses result from a combination of situational pressures and all too human modes of thinking. And Don Langevort, who's professor at Georgetown, has written that cultural and situational pressures can cause bad behavior even among good people. So there's this idea of a slippery slope. A slippery slope is a process or series of events that is hard to stop or control once it's begun, and usually leads to worse and more difficult things. So asking our panelists, is there one thing that you can point to, one small thing that led you down this slippery slope to committing the conduct that ultimately ended up in your conviction? Richard, you get to start. The
So
last shall be first.
there always is that first step. And for me, it occurred in, as I remember it, and I can't say precisely, but I'm pretty close in the time period. It occurred in Tierra del Fuego when this agent shares. Now, this is an intermediary that's intertwining legitimate and corrupt business services, doing translations, introducing me to end users, helping me to develop and understand market opportunities. This is not someone you're going to find in a Panama Papers database. So he shares with me as part of his success and his success fee that he's paying tolls to win tenders. So right there, I knew that by nodding my head and not reporting the fact that he's paying a bribe to win, I have violated the law, right? So that was the moment for me. And when offers would come years later, where I had to do a lot more than nod, where I'm dummying up paperwork, I'm submitting false invoices, to pay bribes to public officials, I'm indexing those requests to the fact of I'm already doing this. Like, this is just how it gets done. Now, what you're asking me is an escalation, but I wasn't indexing it to violating the law. I was indexing it to, okay, I get it.
Is there something different that you could have done at that moment? Looking back, as you stood there, was
So
there
that's the
something
question
different?
I had 14 and a half months in prison to think about, right? I wasn't prepared for risk until I was in the middle of it. So I spent 14, 15 years working among U.S. law enforcement and U.S. military personnel and organizations. That's a very safe place. And, I was not organizationally, emotionally, and just having the tools to deal with risk until I was when I was in the middle of it, then I started to figure it out. So when I'm asked what could have been done differently, I think that would have been a conversation before I got on that first flight, where if I would have understood what I was about to go into, because I was going to be put in harm's way, without a doubt. You're not going to work in some of these marketplaces without having corrupt exposure. Now, what do you do with it? What are the resources that are there to support you? And how are you expected to engage? Because I'll tell you what, in some parts of the world, and someone's talking about corruption, you may not want to say no right there in front of a person, that might have contacts in law enforcement and with the military, and you find yourself wrongly prisoned, and now you're not safe. So, in some cases, it's say you need to freshen up, get to your hotel, call us, and then we have a plan to get you out of country. So it's not as simple as just saying no in some of these places. So I think the different point, the part that could have changed is to understand what I was getting into before I got into it, and understood what resources were there to help me, and then to know how to engage, what to do if it happens.
Okay, thank you. Walt,
For me, it's kind of like when did I know? I mean, it was a confusing time because it was I was encouraged to do what I did at first. I mean, that's what doesn't make sense for what ended up happening to me, because when I first did it, it was accepted. We have to make numbers, and making the numbers meant putting something off for a month or a quarter, and that was not only encouraged, that was ideas that came from besides me, and few people questioned that. So once I started doing it, with Richard, I didn't think it was a victim. I thought it was okay. I didn't think it was ethical, but I didn't think it was illegal. And then, as I delved more into it, I could see the things that were going wrong, but I could also see the corruption around me. So, my first bit of crossing the line wasn't that I felt like I crossed the line, I felt like I was encouraged to cross the line. And then once I was on the other side, I didn't see any lines. I didn't know where the lines were. And it's just pretty much as simple as that.
How about you, Rashmi?
So for me, as a solo practitioner, it's very different than both Richard and Walt, because I wasn't stuck in a corporate setting. I also wasn't internationally in place in very difficult situations. For me, I was my own boss, and along with that came the need for me to prove that I was strong. So I didn't want to ask hard questions, and I didn't want to ask questions at all. I wanted to show that I knew it all. And so when I met this developer, and he asked me to structure these transactions in a specific way, in my head, I made a lot of assumptions. I wrongly assumed that this was, as I said, the heyday in South Florida, so of real estate. And so all of the big developers, as well as the big law firms, I knew were doing something what I thought was similar. And so I assumed, well, I don't have to ask and prove the legality of this because somebody else must have already done it. It must be okay, so I'm gonna just go along with the flow. And I think it's very easy, as a young professional in any industry, whether it's law or business or IT, medicine, whatever field you're in, it's very easy to assume that because you're alone or in a smaller practice, that the bigger guys, the bigger firms that have more resources, that have more compliance departments, that have more money, frankly, to do that research, have done it. And so if somebody's asking you to do it, I was working with a smaller developer who must be getting his ideas from the bigger developers, so it must be okay. And I just rationalized it in my head. Had I just gone to one of my mentors is the managing partner at Squire Sanders, and he stood up for me in court and was there as character witness. But had I just gone to him and said, can you give me your insight on this? I need help. I want to know if this is okay. Or had I gone to any of my underwriting counsel and asked the legality of it, I think it would have led to a different scenario. And I also believe for me, had I not met with the FBI that day, I think for me, I could have changed the trajectory of what happened. I don't think I would have, absolved myself, but I certainly could have changed my role in the investigation over 3 years that led, subsequent to when the FBI came, or 2 years. And so I believe that for me, that's a major inflection point because I wish everything happens for a reason. I wish I could have gone back and not made those assumptions and also chosen to have that, realization that I had done something wrong much earlier in the process and gone in and, worked with the FBI versus, after indictment, which is significantly different in the process.
And to reiterate what you had said, what your trajectory with that was, is that you spoke to them for four hours or so.
Right.
And then for 2 years heard nothing.
Exactly. And so just to give some insight on this, the woman who introduced me to this developer was somebody I had met when I was working with the county, and she was a criminal defense lawyer. And she had been introduced to this developer. And to make a long story short, when the FBI came and knocked on several of our doors, I believe because she's a criminal defense attorney, she knew better. And she knew not to talk to the FBI in that moment. And so what she did, which I've of course learned subsequent to my indictment, she ended up taking the FBI agent's card, it was 2 of them, and I think a couple weeks later, made an appointment with her attorney and went in and laid it out on the table in her opinion, from her position, from her perspective on what she thought the story was, and that's the story that went forward in the investigation. Because she, it was first in, basically. I don't know what the FBI terminology is, but because she went in and said, I want full immunity, I'll tell the story, I'll tell exactly what happened, but only if I get full immunity. And she was fully protected, not even named as a co-conspirator. And so, I don't know if that could have happened for me or would have, but I do believe that things could have been different. And I don't know the system well enough from the FBI's perspective to know. But I do believe it could have gone differently for me.
So what do you think? Special Agent McMurray, we've heard from Richard, we've heard from Rashmi. What can somebody who's a company and potentially an individual do if they find themselves in this kind of a situation? How can they help themselves with respect to the FBI?
Well, obviously, every situation is different, right? But I will say from Rashmi's experience, that you experienced firsthand, that the federal system, as you're very much aware of, is based on cooperation. Really, the cooperation is sort of a cornerstone of our federal law enforcement system. So whether it's corporate cooperation, like in the FCPA arena with self-reporting and things like that, or individual conduct, that our system is slanted very much towards favoring cooperation, much more so than much of the rest of the world. Much of the rest of the world doesn't have the same flexibility that the United States system has when it comes to cooperation. So, of course, as an FBI agent, I'm always going to say it's best to be truthful and cooperate. But in reality, 9 times out of 10, that is the right thing to do, because ultimately, if there is a significant investigation and you've gotten into the crosshairs of whether it's the FBI or chances are you're going to end up in the same room, and it's going to be the difference between having a conversation. The conversation is going to go one of 2 ways, and you certainly wanted to go the first way, as far as the conversation that you referred to of this lawyer. Her conversation with the government was very different than your conversation ended up being. So that would be my advice.
I'll just build on what Bill just said. There actually, within the federal system, the jargon among inmates is, call me a snitch, call me a rat, but call me at home, because that's where I'm at.
Right.
I would just add to what Bill was sharing. I mean, when my lawyer called me and said, we just got a call from the fraud section. You're the target of a criminal investigation. But, they are interested for you to come in and proffer and see if you'd like to cooperate. He said, so we need to have a whole talk about that. And the lawyers might not appreciate this, but I said, can we just save that billable hour? Because I'm going in. This is a decade of misconduct. I wasn't thinking, well, let's just see what they can bring to the courtroom. I'm like, I know I'm in significant trouble. I know I have criminal liability. And, the ability to cooperate and plea, hopefully it's to everyone's benefit. And even Judge Leon, when I got sentenced, he said, Mr. Bistrong, I'm not going to give you home confinement. That's not the lesson of the story here. But you did and I'm almost quoting him here, he said, you did the right thing by cooperating, because although I'm sentencing you to 18 months today, had you not cooperated, I would be giving you between 8 and 11 years. So it makes a significant difference in one's life that these opportunities are there.
I just wanted to add to that, because I think Richard's situation is very different from what mine was. It was painful for me. It was heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching, and really what helped me get to that was, thankfully, I had an amazing attorney who led me down the path to making me realize that I had done something wrong, and he happens to be a dear friend. Of course, I've been practicing law for almost 20 years, so he lived a mile from me. Our kids are friends, and when he took on the case, he said, we're going to trial. And after we got through discovery, he sat me down and really had to do this very detailed presentation with my parents in the room to convince us that he wanted me to plea. And ultimately he said, Rashmi, I love you too much to let you go to trial. You are facing 20 to 30 years, and you're going to lose. This is why. And I mean, my dad walked out of the room several times and was crying. I was hysterical. My attorney was crying. And so for most people, and I'm not saying it wasn't hard for you, Richard, I understand it was, but it was really hard for me to admit that I had done something wrong. And because we all hold this line that I certainly thought I wanted to be the perfect daughter, the perfect girl. That was my thing, my whole life. And what helped me when I was going through this, ultimately, which led to me pleading guilty, was I listened to Dr. Brene Brown. I don't know if any of you've read it, her TED Talk on vulnerability and shame. And for me, it was very powerful to accept that walking in shame or being and allowing yourself to be vulnerable allows you to be strong. It's not a sign of weakness, it's actually a sign of strength. And for me, that was really, I don't know, empowering to allow me to get to the point where I could face my community and say, I did this, and face my children. You know, I honored my children with the truth. They're very young. They were in 4th and 5th grade when I told them I was leaving. And so, you know, I think that moment or that realization that you should cooperate didn't occur to me. It just didn't even occur to me. Because I didn't know that was the best way to go. Nobody guided me on that. And two, because I was in this like bubble, I didn't think that would be right for me. You know, I wanted to hide from it.
So one of the things we've talked about so far is this idea of a slippery slope. I'm going to talk about a couple of other things that people experience in high-pressure situations. And if you guys can just weigh in on whether or not any of these things was applicable to you. I think Walt actually mentioned this a little bit earlier, this idea of loss aversion. The concept of loss aversion suggests that people become more risky in their behavior when they're faced with the threat of losing something, as compared when they're faced with the opportunity to gain something. That being that you might not do something in order to get that $100,000 job, but you might do that thing in order not to lose that $100,000 job.
You know, I had no financial pressures on me. I was well compensated. That wasn't an issue. And everybody's story is always going to be different. But I really identified with you know, with my job at MCI. First of all, I'd come from the defense industry, so you know, like I'd been worked for the government. You know, it's heavily audited, or it's regulated, and things like that. But the defense industry was all of that. There was a lot of oversight. And MCI wasn't. It was more of a entrepreneurial atmosphere with, you know, fewer checks and balances and flat organization and a lot of decision making, which I found, you know, very empowering. And you know, to look at where, you know, the comparison of jobs that I had and how much I love what I was doing compared to how much, no offense against the government, but the boring job that I was doing, I just didn't find it as exciting. I mean, Bill doesn't work in a non-exciting one. He works in the exciting branch, but you know, just continuing audits and boredom. So to go to a place where I was really challenged and to look at what that had become was to me a very ugly thing to look at. You know, it really was disheartening to, you know, to know that I was sort of faked out, that this was all kind of just all fake for me.
So loss aversion is a huge risk in the defense field. The defense field's not alone in this, where I think risk goes up when your goods or services hit the foreign shores. Okay, so no pun intended, I'll give you a war story, right? So imagine this. I ship $1 million of explosive grenades to Turkey, right? So the payment terms are 90% at the U.S., you know, port of, you know, where they're going to be shipped from, and you get paid in an irrevocable letter of credit in a U.S. bank just when you present your shipping documents. So for anyone in finance, that's like your dream come true, right? There's no risk to that shipment. And right, loss aversion is you'll take more risk not to lose something than to win something. So the goods get to Ankara. Now they have to be inspected to get that other 10%. So you have a choice now. The inspection committee is never going to inspect those goods, or they are going to flunk them. And then how do you get $1 million of explosives back to the United States? I don't even know that you can do that. So there, it's like the bribe is baked into the procurement order. And I wasn't thinking, okay, I need to take care of the inspection committee to win this deal. I just want to get the pain over with and get the company paid, because usually the bonus or the commission is to the individual is paid on complete payment. So that little 10% can hang up someone's whole quota and whole forecast. So that's exactly loss aversion. I call it bribing not to lose as opposed to grand corruption. And there's a tremendous amount of risk in international business where every signature, every stamp, anything that a public official has to do in terms of paperwork to get you paid is an opportunity for that poorly paid public official to ransom what could be a huge order, not to mention someone's quota and their forecast and their bonus, for what we might think of as a small bribe. So there's a lot of loss aversion in my world. And, you know, the joke in Turkey is the wealthiest people in Turkey were the people on those inspection committees. Because, you know, when you meet up with your competitors, you're swapping stories about this is the way it goes. So you're like, yeah, if I don't do this, someone else is certainly willing to.
Professor Langevort has said in behavioral ethics and behavioral compliance that being ethical is hard work, that stress and tiredness can actually weaken the ability to make ethical decisions. He has also said that when the threat of punishment is both uncertain and distant, the potential for wrongdoing increases. And he bases this on research. So I ask each of you this idea of sort of stress and exhaustion, and was that something that came into play for you? And also the second question being this idea of distant timing, like this idea that I'm not so sure I would get caught, and even if I did, this is the situation right now, and that's something that's really way in the future. Did any of those come into play for any of you?
Well, so I had 2 kids under the age of 2 when this was happening, and so I was very tired, usually most of the time, but I'm generally a high energy person, and but I will say that there were moments where I was multitasking at its finest. So I would be, you know, taking care of the kids or feeding them or making them sleep while checking emails on my BlackBerry at the time, and forwarding emails along without doing the diligence that an attorney is expected and should be doing. You know, when I got sentenced, the judge said, as a lawyer, you're held to a higher fiduciary duty. You had a higher fiduciary duty to do the diligence to ask the questions, and I wasn't doing that. I was clearly cutting corners, and I was, an email would come in. I mean, there's a great example that I have that I've realized was December 24th at 8 o'clock at night, 2007. I get this email, and I know where I was. I was making my kids sleep, and it was Christmas Eve. You know, I wanted to get out and wrap presents with my family, and I get this email. It had an attachment. It was in regards to a specific closing, and I just forwarded it on. I literally glanced at it. I forwarded on. I didn't even give it a second thought. Now, why didn't I? I should have. Like, stop. Why aren't you? Read it. Look at it. You know, it was an amount. It was a email that said this amount of money going to the buyer after, based on this guarantee amount. But in that moment, the exhaustion of being with the kids, the need to be a mother and go wrap presents, all of that was like a perfect storm, like Richard said. And so when I allowed that to happen, I didn't even give it a second thought afterwards. It just, I sent it on. It was like passing the buck, really. Pushed it on to my paralegal at the time, and then just assumed, to your second part of your question, I definitely in my head felt that I was a solo practitioner. I was a small piece of 500 other attorneys in Miami that are doing the same thing at big firms and small firms. There's no way what I'm doing matters. And who are the victims? The victims, at the time, my head was the victims are the banks. The victims are, lenders, and they're approving my HUDs. And so I made assumptions that, to what Richard, was saying earlier, that it didn't seem like there was harm being done, Of course, now I know I was causing harm. And I have to accept the fact that I contributed to the entire subprime mortgage crisis collapse, and I take ownership of that. But at the time, that's not what I was thinking. I was thinking, let me get the deals done, let me go back to being a mom. So I think that's a very real thing that most attorneys like me, solo practitioners, which is, I know, very different from Richard and Walt, we're having to deal with, is just moving along to the next day. Okay, this day's over, okay, next, let's do the next transaction, or, and you're not thinking that in combination with all the other factors that what this developer was doing outside that I didn't know of, plus the totality of the 100 closings looked, as a unified whole of what this developer was doing, obviously it's much more severe than each individual transaction. So I wasn't even thinking that. I was thinking, okay, this one's approved, done, let's go to the next one. So.
Richard or Walt, if you want to answer that question.
You know, I think one of my observations is that, cheating is hard work. I always thought that it was easy, right? If you go back to school, somebody give you the answers to the test, it's easy, right? You have all the answers, so you just put all the answers in that somebody gives you. Cheating is hard. It's hard to do. It's complicated. It's complex. It's emotionally draining, and in that, I sort of lost the fact of I must not be cheating because this is too hard. This is too much work. I mean, my other job, doing it right, is easier than what I'm going to extremes to do. And in some cases, look at how I was, trying to distance myself from things victims, things that I thought were wrong. I mean, I went to a lot of elaborate means in order to do that. And when I found myself sort of working this hard and thought about, being caught or something like that, I was like, I mean, I can't imagine that I'm doing anything that much wrong than everybody else isn't doing wrong. Or, if I do get caught, I mean, what are the consequences? I didn't even know what they were. FBI was something I saw on television. I didn't know an FBI agent at the time, but unfortunately I know way too many now. But I never thought about it. I never knew what federal court was. I never knew what federal law was. I never knew what a federal sentencing guideline was. I mean, so when you talk about getting caught, forget getting caught. I didn't know even if I got caught, I didn't know what the consequences were even, I couldn't even imagine what those were. So getting caught really didn't mean, so what, I got caught. I could lose my job or something, but I mean, I didn't know about all the other stuff that comes with it.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably have woken me up at 2 o'clock in the morning during that decade and asked me to recite my forecast and my quota and my bonus, and I could do it, right? Those numbers I had memorized. If you woke me up and said, hey, if you keep doing this, you're going to get in trouble, I would have been like, leave me alone, right? It never occurred to me. I never, one attorney called me an irrational calculator of risk, right? Like, I never even indexed that possibility into my decision making. So the concept of criminal deterrence, now from 1997 to 2007, it wasn't like you were reading a lot about the FCPA the way you are today. I don't even know that would have made a difference, but in the context of that decade, it was totally abstract to me. The part about stress, certainly for those of you that might have a dispersed workforce, I mean, I spent almost a year leaving New York on a Sunday night to get to the company's operations in Manchester for Monday morning, and then I would take the latest flight out of Manchester Friday night to get home on Friday night, right? That creates a very, jet lag state of mind, almost permanent, right? And in that kind of work, when you're feeling jet lagged, sleep deprived, separated, and pressured, that doesn't help anything. Like, those aren't things that will tip you in the right direction. And for me, the real cost of that was my family, because I totally disconnected from my network of loved ones. So my ethical center of mass started to shift away from how I grew up to what I was living in. I think you probably call that, he went local, right? And that's why I always encourage commercial teams who are dispersed and forward-based, like, stay close to your loved ones, like, listen to those voices, keep in touch with them, particularly at those stressful moments, and always try to remember, if you go the wrong way on some of this, those are the voices that you're going to lose. So I think there's a personal element to this that's often ignored in the debate about people trying to stay close to the good times, right?
Thank you. Agent McMurray, in Professor Langevort's article, Cultures of Compliance, he observes, well, let me back up. Certain things that employees do may make a company assume that they're at risk, that they're an at-risk employee for committing misconduct. For example, you look at things like, does a person have financial issues? Do they have drug problems? Is there somebody in their family who's ill? Are there stresses and pressures? But in his article, Professor Langerville also observes that psychologists have uncovered solid evidence linking cognitive creativity with unethical behavior. So my question to you is, how do you identify employees who are at risk? And are there certain at risk for committing misconduct? And are there things that you wouldn't think to look at, that companies should look at, that would put employees at risk to committing misconduct?
Okay. Let me answer that by making a more general observation that mine over the course of my adult life. Right? Is that right? So I was in the military and in the FBI, right? And it was over the course of the last 24 years or so. That experience in my life I've grown a great disdain for headquarters or for distant management, right? When you're on the battlefield and somebody in Washington, D.C. is trying to tell you what you need to do right now, and you're just trying to survive, you really don't want to hear from that person in Washington. When you're working an investigation and you're sitting with somebody like Richard night after night and coming up with a game plan, and this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to do, and you're dealing with that human being every day, you really don't want to hear from Washington, D.C., this is what you need to do with your investigation, right? And I think the corporate compliance world, and I've only been exposed to it for a year since I've been in this particular job, but that's really all I see in corporate compliance is this headquarters idea of, I've got a compliance officer back in home base who's handing out pamphlets and talking about how bribery is bad. But when I ask people that are in the compliance world, well, do you have anybody that's going to Argentina and actually meeting the third party people that your folks are dealing with? And the answer is 100% of the time, no. No, that we're not. We don't have the budget for it. We don't have this. We don't have that. We don't do that. We give symposiums. We give out pamphlets. We talk about it, but we're not actually out there on the ground experiencing it firsthand with the people that are experiencing it. Because to sit back someplace and sort of go down a checklist of, does he have financial trouble? Is he too motivated? Is he not motivated enough? Is he this? Is he that? You could talk yourself into either believing somebody's a problem or not a problem. You could go down the list of all the employees and argue one way or the other that they're a problem or they're not a problem. But if you don't know them, if you don't ever meet them, if you don't ever get out in the field and actually see what they're experiencing, you're never gonna have a significant compliance program. It's impossible. It's impossible to do from a distance.
It's interesting because I was having this conversation today specifically about law students and lawyers. And we were having a conversation with several of the people I graduated with at Columbia. And the conversation went, it's great when you're in law school and you're learning, you have classes on ethics, and you take this one class, you take that second class, and in Florida you have to take an ethics class to be admitted to the bar. You have to pass the ethics portion of the test. And all of that's well and good in the esoteric, as Bill's mentioning, but until you're faced with the reality of making that decision, with all their other pressures and, essentially role playing. So we were brainstorming that, law schools should incorporate, whether it's through, your program here, I know Columbia has CAPI there for professional integrity, but some sort of model where, and this is not just lawyers, I think that, business school students, graduate students that are facing professions where they're either going to have pressures from their bosses or they're going to have pressures from their clients, or they're going to have their own self-made induced pressures that to put themselves into a position of actual role playing, with, what are the consequences? What do you do in this scenario? Now, it's still an academic exercise, but it's much more real than just being taught and being given a pamphlet, because it doesn't put you into that mindset. And it's not just a one-day thing. I mean, it has to be over the course of, 6 months where you're put into this mindset. So that then when you graduate from whatever professional school you're at, you remember, like, oh, that's what it felt like. Let me make sure I make this decision versus the wrong one.
The other thing that I think you constantly have to take into account is human beings in life change on a moment to moment. So a person who is at absolutely no risk 6 months ago might be at a huge risk now. And again, it's just that, to me, just as an observer now of the compliance programs, to try to do it from a distance and have sort of a blanket sort of compliance program and not really know the human beings that work for you, it's very, very difficult to have an effective compliance program that way. And some of the really large companies, I understand it's very, very difficult to do. Like, for instance, in the FBI, obviously, we have all these security procedures because we have a top secret clearance where you have to fill out this paperwork every year and talk about your financials and disclose it all to the government. But that's thousands of FBI agents just in the FBI filling out that paperwork and submitting it to somebody, and chances are it's not really being looked at all that closely. And even if it was, if you really were a spy or if there was some security risk there, it's not going to be reflected in those financials. That isn't where you're going to find it. So we have our own sort of compliance programs in the government, but really they're check the box, CYA type program. They're not catching spies, really. That's not really what it's about. And I think most compliance programs aren't about catching people that aren't compliant. I think they're about CYA and it's a government. The government has imposed this on us, so we have to have some program and we have to have something to fall back on to say we had a program when there's a problem, rather than really getting down into the weeds of trying to solve the problem.
Okay, so in terms of getting down into the weeds to try to solve the problem, what do you suggest? For companies who are trying to get to know their employees, get to know, employees who may be high risk, areas that may be high risk, because you talked about both. Right. You talked both about the person and about the situation that they're going into. You talked about how remote compliance programs and folks who are running those programs can be. What do you suggest in your experience, having worked with both foreign corruption and international organized crime, and having sat across from defendants who have committed misconduct, what would you recommend that corporations do to better their compliance departments?
I think a compliance program is very much like law enforcement, right? That you're essentially an investigator or an investigative body within the company, and reading financial statements, looking at numbers, all that's very important. And it's important for the FBI when we're conducting a white-collar investigation, that 2-year period. I'm sure there was agents pouring through documents and trying to understand what happened. But at the end of the day, law enforcement and compliance, because again, I think they're very similar, it's about human beings. It all comes down to human beings, and if you take that human being interaction out of the equation, you're never going to be effective. So how do you interact with those human beings? You have to have a program where you're actually out there having the same experiences that the people that are your high-risk employees are experiencing. You have to experience them yourselves. For instance, we have younger generation FBI agents now, right? And they're into the phones and computers and whatnot, and they sit in their cubicles. And me and some of the older agents, We call that their cubicle of justice. And we say, you're never going to solve a case sitting in your cubicle of justice. You're never going to make a case there. The human beings that you need to talk to are on the streets of New York City, or in our case, they're around the world. And talk to me when you're actually talking to human beings, when you have somebody that you can bring in that is going to tell us the story. And that has to be a huge part of any compliance program, as far as I'm concerned, is you're out there interacting with human beings. And not just the people in your company, but the people that they're dealing with. If you really wanted to have a real robust compliance program, you would have a compliance officer go with somebody, Richard, to Argentina and say, I'm gonna sit right next to you. This agent isn't gonna know who I am, and we're just gonna go through this deal. I'm just another employee. Let's just walk through the deal and see how it goes. And when he says, oh, I'm paying tolls for tenders, if the company's serious about being compliant, the person's going to be right there. He's going to experience it firsthand, and he's going to come back to the home company and say, all right, this is the situation on the ground. So either we find a solution for it, or we get out of that particular business. But it's not fair to put Richard in a position where he's making the decision on his own of whether or not to do that or not. It's the company's responsibility to make that decision. And some companies, they do make that decision to go ahead and pay that toll. Certainly do, but in a lot of ways, I think the compliance programs that I have seen now over the course of the last year, in a lot of ways, they're cowardly to me. They're putting the pressure on the working people that are actually out there doing it, instead of the people in the boardroom and the people in the C-suite to say, we sent our compliance team out there, we sent an undercover team out there with our people, and we know exactly what our business in India looks like now. Are we gonna keep doing that, or are we gonna walk away from that? And that's, to me, a real compliance program.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of corporate culture. We hear a lot about corporate culture now in the news. We hear it with cases that are brought up. We hear from the Department of Justice, you need to have a good corporate culture, a compliance culture. Let's talk a little bit about what the culture was like in each of your, we heard from you, Walt, about what the culture was like, and they sort of pushed you toward what you were doing. Was that the culture of the entire company, or just your particular area?
It was really the culture of the industry. I mean, it was a deregulated industry. We aspired to be the next Bernie Ebbers. I mean, it's hard to believe that that's true, but that's who we all looked up to. There was a guy who started off as a junior high school basketball coach, is now a billionaire, right? And it was a wild west of people making a lot of money very quickly, and really heavily, a lot of incentives. I mean, it was really the first time that salespeople and executives start making really unbelievable amounts of money. I mean, we were there when, there's big bonuses, there's huge stock options. I mean, that's what was driving that culture at the time. I mean, and there's still stock options. I mean, it's changed a little bit, but I think the biggest thing that's an indicator of culture at every telecom company that I went into in the 90s and early 2000 was when you walked in the door, your stock price closed from the previous day was in the front door. That was the culture. There was only one goal. It was very simple. What's that number today?
So this idea has come up in some of the things that we've done here at the program on corporate compliance and enforcement, this idea of like a subculture. So you have, a corporate culture, and you might have an excellent corporate culture, and you might have an excellent tone at the top, but then you might have a unit that becomes sort of its own subculture, its own rogue culture. How do you look out for that, and how do you account for it? How do you stop it in a company? If you're committed to compliance, you're committed to your C-suite folks saying the right things and really meaning it, how do you make sure that a sort of a rogue subculture doesn't come up within the company?
Well, I mean, a multinational is going to have a lot of hidden corners in it, right? And from my perspective, in a big multinational, the international group had its own subculture, right? I guess it fits into that description of a cocoon of corruption. We figured out how to get it done together. So I think this relates a little bit to that culture question, because there's no shortage of discussion about tone at the top. But in a lot of, large organizations, what tone at the top is? The person's supervisor. The tone of the company is represented by who a person reports to. So I've seen and experienced a lot of compliance go wrong at that level, because their voice, whether it's a quarterly roll-up call or the sales planning process, if it's all about, we've got to get this deal done, and there's no insertion of, never forget, we still care how you get it done, that's, I think, where those subcultures start to develop. And I think where culture can go wrong at that middle level management, because that's who the workforce reports into.
Yeah, along those lines, again, I'll use the FBI as an example, right? I mean, we've had a little rough go in the news the last couple of weeks, but generally, I would say, we're held in high regard. The organization is held in high regard, extreme high integrity. We have FBI agents all over the world, in Dhaka and Djibouti, and there's not this worry that they're going to go rogue because they're on the other side of the world in this 1 or 2 man office. Certainly, there's plenty of opportunities there, right, for bribery and things like that. An FBI agent could potentially make a lot of money by passing secrets or passing information on, but there's this culture from the top, and they're enveloped in the cocoon of integrity, really, no matter where they are in the world. And in this day and age, with FaceTime and all this, there's absolutely no reason why a certain entity of a company should feel like they are out there on their own and can operate in a completely different fashion than the rest of the company. Like you said, if you use an example where the C-suite earnestly believes in integrity and a culture of integrity in that company, there's ways to reach every single member of your company around the world and envelop them in that cocoon of integrity, and not let them slip away. Because listen, there is a reason why our overseas assignments, there's a term limit on them. They regularly get inspected. People come out from Washington, sometimes announced, sometimes not announced. They're on video conferences several times a week, because there is a natural tendency you're on the other side of the world. I mean, when husbands leave and you're going to Bangkok, you get a little extra, look from the wife, and a little extra either hug or maybe something else, saying, all right, I'll see you in a couple of days when you come back. When you go to Quantico, it's like, all right, I'll see you later. So there's that human nature of, I'm on the other side of the world, I'm in some exotic place that nobody knows me here. I'm so far removed from my family, you almost live like 2 different lives, right? You get so disconnected from your family, especially on extended international travel, that you can make decisions you would never ever make, back at home. So I just keep going back to, I think it's critically important, if you're talking about compliance, that those human beings, they need to be enveloped in that. I keep using your term because I like that term, Richard, a cocoon of integrity, and not a cocoon of corruption.
So for me, since I was a solo practitioner, at least as it pertains to my case, my corporate culture came from me, which is good and bad, because I believe maybe if I had some direct person to report to, or, and it's not that I didn't work at law firms and had bosses that I reported to, but in this scenario, I didn't have anybody to ask the questions to or to get from any culture, good or bad. So I sort of set my own tone, and my culture comes from my family. from watching my parents and their ethic, and which is a very strong work ethic. But you know, I did want to speak a little bit too, because I was in investment banking and I did work for a very large investment bank. And at the time, this was in the 90s, and there definitely was, you know, not only a Morgan Stanley culture, but I worked in corporate finance, which was separate from M&A, which was separate from, you know, capital markets. And then within corporate finance, we had individual groups, and every one of the groups had their own subculture. And I remember interviewing, and, you know, I ended up choosing to go to a specific coverage area because of the subculture, because of the people that made up that group. And we used to call it, you know, when I began to interview for younger associates, we used to call it, does that person pass our bullpen test? So do I want to be working at 3 o'clock in the morning and having a drink with this person? Because that's our little subculture within our group. So I think that that comes, for us, it came from the managing director within our group in the investment banking division that I was in. But I believe it comes from the top, and it has to, you know, whoever's at the top has to lead with a level of integrity and ethical decision-making, but actively engaging, like Bill said.
There's also this idea of a speak-up culture. We've talked about it here at NYU. Research shows that fear and futility are two of the main reasons that people do not speak up when they see something going wrong. Research also shows that harmful, unethical, and criminal behavior is less likely to occur in the presence of a dissenter. I am getting over a horrible cold. Clearly. I'm going to try to speak up. Thank you, Jeff. So, harmful, unethical behavior is less likely when somebody dissents. Did any of you speak up? Would you have spoken up? Could you have spoken up? And what could you have said? When could you have said it?
I didn't. I didn't speak up, and probably one of my biggest regrets. I mean, I think one of the things that happens in unethical or criminal activity is to become involved. You fail to ask questions, and I didn't. And I can say this: neither did anybody else. I mean, you know, I think I would have felt better. You know, forget policies and procedures and compliance. If just somebody. If I'm not feeling comfortable, or I'm just like wondering whether we should do this or not, and if somebody else speaks up, it sort of provides this, you know, this like, well, they're okay, well, I'm safe now. I can speak my mind. This person spoke, you know, their mind, and said, well, I don't know if we should do this or not, because I mean, it's easy to go along. It's also it's even easier not to say anything, and that's sort of where I found myself. I didn't say much. And the other people around me didn't say much. And I think going back to my opening statement was about, you know, this isolated decision making. I think that drove a lot of it. So I just didn't hear a lot of questions. I mean, it was very much results oriented. I mean, each of these have talked about the results that they're trying to get. And I think that drives a lot of the questions that we answer. You know, is this question going to hinder me getting the result that I want? And I certainly saw, you know, me asking the question as being a hindrance to doing anything, and when nobody else spoke up, it, I think, empowered me more.
I think it's an excellent question, and it's still a challenge. I mean, when you think about processing a transaction or delivering an international order or providing services, I mean, it does take a village, right? It's not one person. You have people in finance, sales order support, logistics. There are a lot of eyes and ears on any transaction. And, you know, I always ask the question, do the people, and not in a derogatory sense, but do people down in the organizational chart, the people on the shop floor, sales order processing or accounts receivable, do they feel empowered to say, this just doesn't look right, this isn't the way we usually do things around here, I need to talk to someone about this? Or do they feel like, this was given to me by my supervisor, this is what I'm paid to do, and I'm going to process this the way I was just instructed to. Kroll and Compliance Week did a survey, I think it was 2014, which demonstrated that most people who are in the support functions of an organization do not feel like they are compliance ambassadors, and that it's their role to speak up if something just doesn't look right. So I think that's still I think it's a wonderful opportunity because there are a lot of people that do see wrongdoing, but I still think based on the research and the surveys, most of them just don't feel like, I think that's the futility part, Serena. Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely say, when you're talking about international corruption, right, that the futility part is a huge piece of this, because, like Richard said, and many people I've talked on panels about the FCPA, sort of one of the big arguments against it is, listen, that's just the way certain parts of the world work, and if American companies don't pay these bribes, somebody else is going to pay them, and the world's just going to keep on going that way. And I think that is all part of the futility thing of, like, what are we really trying to accomplish here? Are we ever going to get Chinese public officials to stop taking bribes? Are we ever going to, change a culture in these countries around the world? And when you look at the big picture, it can be very disheartening, right? I remember years ago working drug cases, and I started off working fairly low-level drug cases, and then later on in my career, I ended up working drug cases that were essentially government-sponsored criminality, government-sponsored drug trafficking. And you get to a point where you say, what are we doing here? Is it worth it? Is it worth a 25-year career or even fighting this? But one of the senior supervisors at the time, he said to me, he said, you just do it because it's the right thing to do. And if you just take that attitude, if every human being took that attitude, if you just do it because it's the right thing to do, a lot of the world's ailments would go away. So I just would say, it would be important to instill in people, when you're talking about a company's culture, of, I don't really want to hear about, I don't have a lot of patience. I don't want to hear about, well, if we don't do it, somebody else is going to do it. We're not going to do it. And if that's the culture of the company, and somebody starts sliding off that slope, it just makes it that much easier. And all it takes is one person to speak up, and the whole thing falls to pieces. Like what it sounds like you were describing. Well, if one person had spoken up, it can't go forward, right? So, and that's I think an important aspect of corporate culture is, you got to instill that culture to a point where you just need one person to say, this can't work. And that's basically kind of what the SEC whistleblower programs are based on, and all that, of you just need one. You just need one person to come forward. So that's my point on futility, because you can have a whole discussion on that for sure when you're talking about these topics.
So I have about 100 more questions, but I want to ask the audience if they have questions. Yes, Tim.
Hi, I'm Tim Linden. I'm Chief Compliance Officer for a multinational. Thank you all for coming. It's just been fascinating. I'm particularly interested in sort of the questions Serena's been asking about the academic research, because it so relates to the things you've been talking about, feeling there was no harm or rationalization or not having the facts. I just want to ask one practical question of how I can do a better job. Richard said that he wasn't prepared for risk until he was in the middle of it. And then Rashima said, they don't teach you really how to deal with these things in law school. Is there something practically that I can do to really train people that would have avoided this? Is there a way to put you in these real life situations before you go? Or is that just not useful given the pressures you faced?
Go ahead, Richard.
Well, thank you for the question. I think part of it is who's having that discussion with the person. And I think someone from the business unit, someone with P&L responsibility, has to be in the room for that discussion, because when it comes from a P&L manager, you're hearing it not just as, okay, this is the bolt-on compliance discussion, but okay, this is coming from the person that's managing me in the commercial workforce. So I think part of it up front is who's having the talk. But part of it is based on your willingness to invest in understanding that marketplace, what the risks are, what the expectations are realistically going to be for that individual in terms of their compensation, in terms of when you're expecting to see a return on your investment. So these are all things where you've baked that risk into that individual's goals before their boots hit the ground. So I think when that discussion is just more than here's what you're expected to do, here are the guardrails, where it's here's what we've learned about where we're about to put you. Here's what we think we can expect. So, you know, we have a system where you're going to be incentivized. Your forecasts are going to reflect that risk. Okay, so understand that your compliance program is your partner to success. It's a part of your strategy here. And I think that's when people say, okay, wow, this is not just any compliance officer, this is a very visible compliance officer, and that they respect this situation before I'm in the middle of it. And I think the good news about sort of showing your humanity and your vulnerability is to say, if we've got this wrong when you get into country, if we miss something, please call us. Okay, because no one's going to understand this better than you once you're in it. But if we didn't get it right, like, don't take it into your own hands. So you've created right there almost not a whistleblower, but a speak up, I think, environment before that person moves on to that position. So I think just showing your vulnerability in those discussions opens up the dialogue, where if someone feels that this is not exactly what they told me, it's, I need to call back home and, you know, maybe we can figure this out together.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that, because I think that the human element of this is huge. Because for somebody to, you know, everything that Richard's saying going into any situation, whether it's locally or internationally, is very powerful in terms of empowering somebody to hopefully make the right decision. But there's also the element of what happens when that person has already done something wrong, or might have already chosen in a way that now, in hindsight, that he or she realizes it's not right. And that person also needs to be empowered to be able to speak up and say, I made a mistake, or I did something wrong. And that, not that it's okay, there has to be consequences, but that it's human, and that we are all going to, you know, in some way or the other, have to learn these, you know, mistakes. And maybe it's a shameful moment, maybe it's a vulnerable moment, but it's a moment where we can learn from it, and then how do we jump off the platform from there with lessons learned, so that, you know, the next person, or even the same person, now is better going forward, because they're not going to make that same wrong decision, because you've talked about it and had that conversation. So I think it's both going into it, and there has to be a culture of the ability to talk about it. If something does go wrong, how do we deal with that? Are we going to fire the person? Are we going to have a conversation where that person can then go and talk to their peers about what went wrong? So there has to be a learning opportunity as well, I believe.
It sounds like you're all saying that there really has to be internal processes where you've thought all these things through, and there's people to speak to, not simply here's the book, but this is what our process is going to be, and it's going to be one that's collaborative. That's what it sounds like each of you is saying in some measure. I know Jennifer had a question.
Thank you all very much for coming. It's a great honor for PCCE. I had listening to you speak about the causes of crime, I hear three things, one of which was some uncertainty, in some cases not, but about some grayness initially on whether or not this was really wrong, not wrong, a pretty clear sense you wouldn't get caught, but then being presented with a problem where the easy solution was crime, but without a clear alternative solution, where you wouldn't lose everything, lose the client, lose your commission. And I wondered, picking up on Tim's question and something that Serena was just saying about one approach I hear some firms doing from a compliance perspective, which is internal reporting systems that really encourage not just reporting wrongdoing, but questions. I'm not sure about this. But then where there are weekly or monthly memos saying, here are questions that have come up, this was on this side of the line, this wasn't. Here's a hypothetical of someone who actually would have crossed the line as a way of making it salient, and here's a hypothetical of someone who managed not to, and here's how they could solve it. If there was more feedback from compliance about real-world stories and real-world problems that identified bad conduct, maybe reminded you that XYZ employee no longer works for us because they went over this way, but here are good solutions to your problem, whether that could have helped in addition to locating compliance maybe a little more embedded and not quite so separate.
I mean, this is just, I blog not only for NYU Law, but also for Forbes.com. And one of the things that I see with corporations in general is that when things go wrong, they typically don't like to talk about it. And I think that's in some ways understandable, but it's something that that needs to be overcome. I think that talking about the bad employee or I think that we're going to have to face what were the weaknesses, what happened, and let's discuss it. I mean, I think a lot of times that it is difficult to discuss. It just has to be done. I mean, it has to be done. Like, what happened to this person? You can't just have the constant theme that it was a rogue employee. I just think that that's just not right. It's proven to not be right. I mean, it's some of the things that Bill has talked about. The themes that he sees about the person and the individual. He's not talking about rogues. He's not talking about some criminal mind. He's talking about people with MBAs and PhDs and that are flying around the world and doing a lot of really high pressure things. And so to single someone out as a rogue and then think that you've solved some problem, I think is disingenuous. And I think but at the same time, I respect that it's a really difficult thing to do. But I think it needs to be done.
And it's a great question, though, because a compliance program that's a scared straight program is not going to be successful. It has to inspire, right? So what are the ways that you can inspire your commercial workforce? Maybe it's by doing an international volunteer program and saying, you know what, we're going to help these communities that we work in that we never really get to see what's going on there and, do something good. I mean, at the end of the day, it should uplift your workforce, because I think, just like you said before, the scared part isn't enough to really, I think, change a trajectory. I think that it has to be a positive source of inspiration.
I also think in this scenario of whether it's graduate programs, but also professional companies like a consulting company or a law firm, not only to have the role play, but I think that when young professionals especially feel very disconnected. So they're most young attorneys, let's say, are very overworked and they're trying to prove themselves, and they have no idea what their colleague is doing down the hall because they're so engrossed in what they're having to do and their deadlines. And if there's a culture of conversation where the potential ethical decisions or gray lines that are being dealt with or having to be dealt with are discussed at a group level, I think there's more opportunity to see what could be the right way to choose instead of dealing with making decisions in isolation, not talking to your peers, which I know for young professionals is pretty significant.
I actually haven't heard that phrase before. It may be used 1,000 times, but if not, this idea of a culture of conversation. I don't know if other people have heard that phrase. Otherwise, I'm going to attribute it to you from now on.
Okay, there you go.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm not in a rush. Yes, Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm a student here at NYU Law, and I have a question about collateral consequences and just exactly how your federal or your conviction it changed your life, and how are you able to reinvent yourself? And how is someone who has a conviction that's not, a typical white-collar conviction, what barriers do you see them facing that you didn't face? For example, someone who has a drug conviction, they're not going to get paid to go around and consult about their drug conviction, whereas a lot of you guys seem to be doing such that. And so, yeah, can you just speak to your collateral consequences and how you're able to reinvent yourself despite your convictions?
I actually use that word. I feel like it's an opportunity I feel like, oh my God, I have this amazing gift to reinvent myself. So my collateral consequences was, most importantly, of course, I lost my bar license. And so I voluntarily revoked my license in Florida. I can reapply. It was a 5-year revocation, so now in 3 years I can reapply, which we'll see. I may or may not do that because it's a pretty long, timely, and costly process. I owe a very large restitution to the government. It's a joint and several restitution, but for the rest of my life, that's money that I will always have to be paying back to the government. I also am on supervised release, which I believe we all had to do. So those are the sort of collateral consequences. But the real human stuff was, I'm going through a divorce. My children were alone. Well, they were surrounded by love, thankfully, but they didn't have their mom around for almost 6 months. And my daughter was 9 and suffered pretty significantly academically and emotionally and physically. And so when I came back, I was in full force in mom mode. But I will say that my time of incarceration when I was there, I served both in a federal camp, but I also did have to serve some time in a county jail. So I was exposed to demographics of all varying degrees. And one thing that I definitely walked away from was this clarity that the only thing that separates me from pretty much any other person that I was around was that I happened to be blessed with this great life of a family that, told me I was a good person and loved me. And I think a lot of people in our system that are within the BOP, both state and federal, don't have that sense of empowerment. And so when they come out, it's really easy for them to fall back into a trap and commit again. I think the barriers are huge. I do right now, I also have community service that I'm doing, and I'm working with an organization where we're trying to empower people in reentry programs, because the biggest hurdle for any of us, and it's not easy, is where are you going to work? How are you going to make money? How are you going to provide for your family? Because there's a natural stigma, no matter how positive we all are about what we've gone through, it's an automatic stigma that people will attach to us forever of what we've had to go through. And so there's huge collateral consequences of that. And for me, I choose to hold my head up high and talk about it and own it. And I have to realize there's people that won't talk to me moving forward and won't want me in their lives. And it is what it is. I'm never going to be able to change that. I think it's going to be a constant challenge to reinvent myself. Financially, I'm still struggling with how I'm going to do that. So, for me, I choose to take a lot of positivity from my friends and family around me and from my spirituality. And that keeps me going daily, but it's every day, it's another day of deciding what I'm going to do and reinvent myself.
So I'd like to try to take a couple more questions because I saw a ton of hands, but I'm going to go to Karsten first. I'm going to go around.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Karsten Thames with Bertelsmann. Richard, you mentioned incentives, sales incentives, that more than 50% of your compensation was contingent upon meeting your aggressive sales targets. How much of a chance do compliance programs, Tone from the Top, training initiatives, and all these things have if they're up against, this very aggressive performance goals and incentives? Do we kind of have to fix that before we can expect people to listen to Tone from the Top and feel inspired by our leaders?
Yeah, and this, I know we're colleagues with Mark Hodak, who spends a lot of time talking about this, and he shares how, an incentive system can incentivize people to do the wrong thing and de-incentivize people to do the right thing, okay? So he has a great analogy. You should all think of your incentive systems like prescription medication. They have side effects. Okay? They all do. Understand what they are when you're developing them and address them, because you don't want a situation where, and this was certainly my case, bad behavior hid behind very good performance for a decade, right, until the tide rolled out. And very often a bad incentive system can go hidden for a long time. So I think when compliance leaders are at that table and saying, we just want to make sure that we're all pointing in the right direction. And having worked for a public company for 15 years, the incentive process is actually a very deep and well-articulated process. They don't come out of nowhere, right? So there's plenty of opportunity for people to give input and to speak up during that process, as opposed to saying, oh, I didn't make my quarter because I didn't pay a bribe. Like, that, to me, has no credibility. But speaking up during the process itself, where everyone shares in that discussion, to where now I call compliance leaders my friends and my colleagues. Back then, y'all were the bonus prevention department, right? That's not how you want your commercial workforce to look at your compliance program, that they're standing between you and success. You want them to think that they are your partner to success. And I can't see you having that conversation if you're siloed out of that incentive planning process. That maybe that's a parochial opinion, but I think it should be considered.
David?
First of all, thank you all for coming forward. And what is absolutely, I think, an important ingredient in all of this is empathy and the ability for everyone to stand in each other's shoes. I was a former prosecutor. Interestingly, we have 3 business people here, but I can tell you the issues you're speaking of transcend the business world. The law enforcement community has had its issues of agents who have cut corners, who have engaged in illicit activities, who have lied and testimony, and there was a terrible, terrible scandal around drug testing in some of the labs and people who were testifying against people. I will also say that, between the calculus that's done inside enterprises and the calculus that's done on the streets about breaking the law, there are probably some lessons. And Serena, this has been a great program. I would just suggest a tagline, which is not just why or how good people can do bad things, but why this keeps happening over and over and over again. And I think the points that you have made, that enterprises, and I don't just mean in the private sector, but I mean in the public sector as well, have not collated the history of what has happened, because there is a pattern to this. And while Richard Leon may want to suggest we can't, give you home confinement because there are issues of general deterrence, respectfully, I'm not sure you're serving 18 months provided general deterrence into the marketplace. And having been inside a large institution beyond being a prosecutor, but at Goldman Sachs, what I can tell you is situational awareness, understanding we're operating in certain geographic regions, we're operating in certain markets. The mortgage crisis from the financial industry was remarkable because the FBI had files and files and files of mortgage fraud, and nobody wanted to enforce any of these cases or bring them to trial. And industry participants who are actually playing by the rules started to see the bad behavior, and nobody was doing anything about it, and it became the slope down here. So what I'd like to suggest, and I think, Serena, this is the whole purpose of why this is everyone's responsibility. It's not law enforcement, it's not enterprise, and certainly not people who have fallen from grace. But there are some very, very repeatable lessons that need to be shared more broadly. Enterprise situational awareness of what it's like to do business around the world and what it's like to do business in cultures where there's actually a history to some of those business practices and be able to compete. And I just wanted, I do have a question. I wanted to share one anecdote.
I knew there was a question in here,
Yeah,
David.
somewhere.
I definitely knew it.
Testimony, I won't go into this, who the CEO of one of the major, actually the largest bank.
It's coming, the question.
Having been called to testify in the financial crisis, had to be confronted with the emails from within their organization of what people were saying and doing. And after some reflection, he said he wasn't so angry at the people who wrote those emails as the people who actually received the emails who knew better and didn't raise their hand. And so as you think about, from your perspectives, what is needed here, I guess my question is, how do you curate the lessons? How does it transcend this particular room? How does this get passed on to the decision makers who actually have to think about the psychological lessons, the academic lessons that need to be known by all the enterprises? So how does this get beyond this room?
Well, first, we begin what we've begun here, which is the culture of conversation. And now I'll let you guys answer.
Just finished Mary Gentile's book, and she talks about how if you talk about behavioral risk, rationalization, just like we've talked about here tonight, if you have those kind of conversations, you have just reduced risk by having them. That if you can get your people to talk about, well, I don't really see compliance and success as going hand in hand. I see it as a zero-sum game. Just someone talking about that, you've solved, maybe it's 49 or maybe it's 51% of the problem, I don't know. But there's research, and that's what we talked about at the beginning, that demonstrates by getting people to talk about those sort of justifications and rationalizations, they are a lot less likely to execute on them. So I think that's one lesson, is just try to have the conversations.
I was going to suggest a road show that should be inside various companies. This has been remarkable.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Bosco.
Thank you. Thank you all. And I think this is a question I'm going to direct towards Walt, and it's an organizational question. You said that you essentially felt alone, right? And that you had nobody to discuss these things with, or at least you chose not to discuss your issues with anybody else. My question is, after what you did was exposed, I guess the first question is, how did it become exposed? And what repercussions were there, if any, to people in your management chain?
When my fraud was exposed by being, it was by accident. I mean, it's just how some of these things are. It wasn't an investigation. There wasn't an audit. There was a question posed to me about a certain journal voucher entry in accounting, and when presented with that, I knew that it was one of my bad deals, and I resigned. I mean, that was pretty much my exit strategy, right? Maybe those will just go away. But just being presented with it, but I'd never, I never really was asked. I was never asked any tough questions. I mean, I'm really a bad white collar criminal. I mean, if anybody would have asked me sort of anything, and I probably would have caved. I mean, if they said, "Oh, what are you doing?" I was like, "Oh shit, I've been caught." I mean, I wasn't that kind of guy. So what happened was, when I was confronted, then I don't answer the questions. It launches an investigation. My company didn't tell on me. I was told on by a vendor, an outside person. So my company did not turn me in, even after discovering, the things that they did, and the investigation steered away from them. Now, going to Bill's thing about cooperators and stuff. I mean, look, I was like anybody else. I'm trying to save my own ass, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it. I didn't even think to tell the FBI or anybody else about cooking the books. I mean, I told on other people that were involved in my conspiracy, the immediate wire fraud, which I learned all about. But as far as telling on the organization, I didn't. And I found out about the magnitude of the accounting fraud when MCI became part of WorldCom and I was incarcerated. So, that was when I found out that this is wow. I mean, I wasn't the only one. I mean, this stuff was really, really wrong.
So as far as you knew, as it was going on, nobody else within the company was being investigated or being fired or
not until the and my crime took place in the midst of the takeover. So some of them were involved later on, with the WorldCom thing came out, but not immediately when I was there.
Yes.
I'd like to thank the panelists for their extraordinary candor. And I have to say that this has left me somewhat depressed. because each of you pointed to a series of factors that I consider psychological compulsion that led you to do what you did, whether it was the expectations of your family and your community and the obligations of your children, or the expectations of your divisional or branch managers for you to meet quotas, or to the psychological compulsion of just simply being a successful employee and viewed by your colleagues as successful. Was very powerful. It led Richard to his irrational calculation of risk. And I guess my concern is that there are a lot of Rashmis out there. There are a lot of Richards and Walts out there. And there are a lot of enablers out there, whether it's the community expectations, colleagues, just ego and sense of pride. And I'm not sure I've heard anything that leads me to believe that those other folks out there are going to take any different path than you did when confronted with the same kinds of opportunities and pressures and expectations that you felt. And I'd like to ask if you have any different view than that.
So one of the things I decided while I was still incarcerated was I wanted to find a way to pay it forward, to at least what I have learned, if I could stop one person from not making the same wrong decision I made, that would be worth it for me. So, you know, one of the things I've been trying to do, in addition to, you know, being a mom and other roles that I play, is to go around to law schools. And you know, frankly, I volunteer and do it. You know, I've gone to Columbia, and I've come here, and I've gone to University of Miami, and any law school that wants to have me, I will come and share my story, because I do think for young lawyers, and law firms too I've been going to, but more as a cautionary tale. And that's not the only thing I can speak on, but I do believe that when somebody hears a tale like mine, and one of the things I say is, look, I'm really smart. I was in your shoes, and this is not something that I planned, or, you know, it wasn't like a calculated decision that I made, but one decision led to another, which led to another. You know, I hope that it isn't so depressing going out there, going forward, and hopefully if each of us, as we have our conversations, and as you all now have your conversations with colleagues, can share, there is a deterrent effect from somebody to be scared shitless of what we've all had to go through. You know, I now know I can survive federal prison and county jail, but I certainly didn't know that, you know, going into it. But you don't want anybody else to have to go through it. You know, that is one of the reasons why I am sharing my story and hoping to help people through that.
And one of the things that Rashmi and I discussed when we met over lunch, and the funny thing is I don't generally form opinions about people when I immediately see them, and I saw her. We don't look similar, but I thought, she's me. She's me. She went to a better law school than I did. I didn't go to NYU. I thought, she's me. And we talked about it, and we talked about some of the things that she had done and some of the things that she could have done differently. And one of the things that came up was this idea of asking the question, instead of asking the question, how can we get this done? The first question should be, should we be doing this at all? So sort of, you know, asking the underlying question before asking the process question, asking the ethical question before asking the process question.
I mean, that points directly to the culture of conversation, right? So if we can have the conversation about ethics, you know, and empowering others to do it versus just trying to get the deal done and make the money and move on to the next client. You know, I certainly didn't want to lose my client, so I wanted to make it okay. Yeah, so I do believe that there's a lot of power in knowing what the right question is to ask, which I don't think we always all know in the moment. So that's also another hurdle we all have to go through. But once you can empower others by sharing, you know, and talking about it, I think that it's more at the forefront of somebody's mind to think about it versus not to think about it.
So I will take another, I know we're a little bit over, but this is fascinating to me. So I don't know if anybody else has a question. Yes?
If one person would speak up, that was part of the discussion earlier. I work with whistleblowers, and apocryphally, people say, well, you know, if a whistleblower got Employee of the Year, that would send a message to the other employees. And I was wondering, if you, at the companies you were at, if that had happened, what would your reaction have been?
I would have not liked them. Just like what happens today with whistleblowers. That's a fact. I mean, whistleblowers do not live a glamorous life, and I don't foresee any employee of the year ever getting a whistleblower award. They may get money, but I don't think that that's really much compensation for what's happened to them. It takes a lot of courage to be, to step forward and take that. I mean, just because you're a whistleblower and when they get to you, if you're representing whistleblowers, they've gone through a hell of a lot before they've gotten to you. Their first line is talking to other people and they've been ignored or they've been, something's happened. And by the time they get to you, they're, the bane of the company. There's nobody that likes them if they find out who they are. And that's a fact. I don't know that changes. I don't know of anybody right now that's a whistleblower who's a CEO of a company. I've heard of a CEO of a company being a whistleblower and he's no longer the CEO of a company. That's happened. So it's a stigma. It goes to the point about speaking up. It's still difficult, and people see that example about what happens to whistleblowers.
Do we have another question over here? Yes, John.
Serena, I've actually got a question for you.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind putting on your AUSA hat again for a minute.
Let me put on my glasses. Hold on. Go ahead.
Given what we've all heard from the panel this evening, their insights, their own self-perceptions, are there takeaways that you think might have helped you to do a better job as a prosecutor in reaching the people who were targets of investigations, the people who clearly merited prosecution but also might be appropriate for cooperation and so on? In other words, are there things that might have helped you to better reach people to say, do you understand what situation you're in? And do you understand enough about yourself to know that you need to make a different choice rather than just, continually reinforcing your self-perception as an ethical person, a good person, and it's always somebody else's fault?
So part of the reason I came to NYU is because I personally was tired of the revolving door of good people coming in and then going to jail. Because as Agent McMurray has said, every single person that comes in has a human story of where they took a first step and then a second step, and then the line moved and they stepped over it again and again and again until they were sitting across from me, and then it was too late. Because there had already been an FBI agent at their door, there had already been a subpoena, and in all likelihood, there had already been a criminal complaint or an indictment. So that's part of the reason I'm here, and that's part of why we're having this conversation and beginning the culture of conversation. I think that's the most critical thing, is that you look at each person, whether you're a compliance officer, whether you're an agent, whether you're a lawyer, that you look at each person in a way that you see the humanity in them, that you see what their pressures are, that you put yourself in their shoes. And one of the things that Agent McMurray had said is you go out to those places, see what a person has to go through internationally, if they're the guy who's getting bribed. In trial, we would always go to the scene of the crime, so you understand it, so you can see it, so that it's not just a photograph, but you actually go, observe, and take in what actually happened in that place. And that's the best way, I think, for C-suite, for compliance officers, for risk managers to really understand and mitigate the risks for their companies, is to really get to know their people and really understand what those people are doing for their company. Thank you. Yes.
I'm interested to know, sorry, Brandon Cunningham, I'm an attorney at Reed Smith. I'm interested to hear about the corporate experience after everything sort of hit the fan. So did you go to your company and explain what had happened? Did they help you find a lawyer? How did you choose who you wanted to work with? Was there collaboration or not? What was the sort of corporate experience after that point?
Go ahead, Richard.
So I was called in by internal investigators on a Sunday, and I decided, so it was the outside counsel, VP of security, and outside investigators. So that was the panel that met me on Sunday. And we spoke for a few hours, and then I called my defense attorney, because I had another issue separate from that, so I already had sort of counsel on board. And I decided to cooperate with the internal investigation. And this is a whole other scenario under the sort of Yates doctrine and the Yates memo. And why did I cooperate internally? Because I figured, number one, I knew I had criminal liability, and I'm going to hope that my best case scenario is that I just get fired. So I figured I would roll the dice, cooperate internally, and get on with life. And ultimately, after I was terminated, my former employer and the UN both sort of vectored into the fraud section with information. Now, it's a little bit of an aside, but I would not make that decision today. So, knowing that I had criminal liability, now, would I know about the Yates memo? No. Would my defense attorney know about the Yates memo on personal accountability? Probably. And if I know that I'm going to end up at the doorstep of the Justice Department, no matter what I do, that's where the vector is going to bring me. I'd rather tell my story in my words and in my voice across that conference table than to have company internal investigators do it for me. So, and I'll just pull back the curtain here, because you both are very nice, and having sat across from a conference table with prosecutors and FBI agents, they were a lot easier to talk to than internal investigators. They really made it easy. They weren't prosecutors, they were journalists. What's going on here? What happened? Tell us. So I just can't see a scenario today, and I think this impacts internal investigations, where a wrongdoer and someone who knows they're in trouble would want to stick with an internal company investigation. So I was not in the tent with that. I mean, I had my own counsel. I wasn't sort of working with the company. I knew I was in trouble. I retained outside counsel to deal with it.
So, finishing on a comment that was made earlier, the article Behavioral Legal Ethics by Jennifer Robinault and Jean Sternlight is part of your CLE packet. And in that article, they say, quote, "It is wishful thinking to assume that only bad apples, people who differ from us in important ways, will make unethical decisions. Ethical blind spots, slippery slopes, and ethical fading may lead good people to behave badly. These insights may offer some comfort, suggesting that there are not as many inherently bad people or bad lawyers in the world as we might believe. But this psychologically rich understanding also raises concerns because it implies that all of us are in danger of behaving unethically should the right or wrong circumstances present themselves." So I'm going to end where we began. In 1850, a popular author, Charles Dickens, released a now classic novel, David Copperfield, and in the beginning said, "I am born. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. And in the pages of the lives of these people, there is much more to come." So I want to thank you all for being here. I want you to know that there's a reception outside, and our speakers will be there if you want to ask additional questions. And we appreciate you coming and spending your evening with us tonight. Thank you.